When we moved to that little village, I didn't think much about the neighbors. It was a small place, everyone knew everyone, and I was just glad to be away from the noise of the city. Our new house was on the edge of the village, right next to a big field. The kind of place where you could hear the wind blowing through the trees and feel peace. But there was one neighbor who caught my attention. His name was Mr. Cheeto, and he lived in a small, run-down house on the other side of the field. He was an older man, with a thin, wiry frame and a face that looked like it had seen too much in life. He kept to himself, rarely came out, and when he did, it was only to stare at the sky or walk around his property. At first, I thought he was just a quiet, lonely man. But there was something about him that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was the way his eyes never seemed to blink, or how he always moved with a strange, stiff gait. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with him. It didn't take long before people started talking about him. I overheard a conversation between two women in the market one afternoon. They were whispering, but I could still hear them clearly. "You heard what happened to his last neighbor, right?" one woman asked. The other woman lowered her voice. "Everyone says he's a witch. They say he used to have a friend who lived in that house, and the friend just disappeared one night. Vanished. Like he never existed." The first woman shivered. "I heard he sacrifices animals at night. Some people claim to have seen strange lights around his house." I wasn't sure what to think of all this. Witchcraft was common talk in the village, but I never took it seriously. It seemed like everyone had some story about someone being cursed or haunted. Still, there was something about Mr. Cheeto's house that made me uneasy. One evening, as I was walking home from the market, I passed his house. It was quiet, as usual. But then, just as I was about to move past, I heard a low, guttural voice. "Come here." I froze. The voice was coming from the other side of the field, where Mr. Cheeto's house stood. I turned slowly, and there he was, standing in the doorway. His eyes locked onto mine. "Come here," he repeated. I didn't move. My legs felt like they were frozen to the ground. There was something in his voice, something that made me feel like I shouldn't be there. Like I was being pulled in against my will. But after what felt like an eternity, I managed to take a step back, then another, until I turned and ran home. When I got home, I told my wife, Zenil, what had happened. She listened quietly, but I could tell she was concerned. "I don't like it either," she said after a while. "He's always watching us. Always staring from his window. Sometimes, I feel like he's waiting for something." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises outside, like someone was walking around our house. I would get up and check, but there was never anyone there. It wasn't until the third time I checked that I saw something I couldn't explain. There, in the distance, I saw Mr. Cheeto standing at the edge of his property. But it wasn't just him. His shadow was moving by itself, stretching and twisting like it had a mind of its own. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. I thought I was just seeing things, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something about Mr. Cheeto was dangerous. For the next few days, things in the village felt off. People started avoiding Mr. Cheeto's house even more. The children stopped playing near the field, and the women would cross the street to avoid walking past his gate. I noticed that every time I went to town, people would whisper when I walked by. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched never left me. One afternoon, I went to visit a friend in the village. His name was Jabu, and he lived on the other side of the village. As I walked down the dirt road, I passed Mr. Cheeto's house. The wind was quiet, and the air felt heavier than usual. It was like everything was holding its breath. I glanced toward the house, and there he was, standing in his yard, staring straight at me. But this time, his gaze was different. There was no warmth, no friendliness. It was cold. Dead. As if he could see straight into my soul. I hurried past his gate, but as I reached the end of the road, I felt a strange sensation in my chest, like someone was pulling at my heart. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was draining me. That night, something strange happened. Around midnight, I woke up to a loud bang on our front door. I rushed downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. Zenil was already up, looking scared. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. There was no answer, but I could hear something moving outside. Something heavy. I slowly approached the door, peering through the small crack in the wood. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a soft voice came from the other side. "Open the door." It was Mr. Cheeto's voice. I stepped back, my stomach sinking. Why was he here? Why at this hour? I didn't open the door. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't explain why. Something inside me screamed to stay away. A few moments passed, and then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. I waited, not daring to move. Then, from outside the window, I saw it. There, standing in the shadows near the gate, was Mr. Cheeto. But he wasn't alone. There were shadows with him, shapes that didn't belong to any living creature. They danced around him, twisting and turning in ways that made my skin crawl. I couldn't look away. My eyes were locked on him as he raised his hands toward the sky, his lips moving in a language I didn't understand. Then, as quickly as the shadows had appeared, they disappeared into the night. Mr. Cheeto turned and walked back into his house. The air felt lighter, but I knew something had changed. The next day, I went to see the village elder, Baba Nia. She was the oldest woman in the village, known for her wisdom and deep knowledge of spirits and the old ways. If anyone knew what was happening, it would be her. I found her sitting outside her hut, stirring a pot of herbs. "Baba Nia," I said, sitting down beside her. "I need your help. Something's happening with Mr. Cheeto. I think he's using witchcraft, and I don't know how to stop it." Baba Nia didn't look up from her pot. She continued stirring slowly, her hands steady. "You're right to be afraid," she said softly. "Mr. Cheeto is not what he appears to be. He has powers, dark powers. He's been practicing witchcraft for many years, and he's learned to control the spirits." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What does he want? Why is he doing this?" Baba Nia sighed and set the spoon down. "He wants to control the village. He wants to use the people for his own gain. The spirits he's calling are ancient and dangerous. They feed on fear, on pain, on death." I could feel my heart racing. "What can I do? How can I stop him?" Baba Nia looked at me with a serious expression. "There is a way, but it is not easy. You must face him in his own home. You must go to his house at midnight, when the spirits are strongest. Only then can you break the hold he has over this village." "But I don't know how to fight him," I said, panic rising in my chest. "You don't have to fight him with strength," Baba Nia said quietly. "You fight him with light, your courage. The spirits cannot stand the truth. They feed on lies and darkness, but they cannot survive in the presence of light." It sounded impossible. But I knew she was right. I had to do something. If I didn't, the village would fall under his control, and we would all be lost. That night, I went home and told Zania what I had learned. She was scared, but she didn't try to stop me. She knew it had to be done. As midnight approached, I grabbed the old lamp from the corner of the room, the one Baba Nia had given me. It had a soft glow, not much, but enough. I left the house and walked toward Mr. Cheeto's place, my steps slow and heavy. The field was quiet, too quiet. There was no sound except for the rustle of the wind. When I reached his gate, I hesitated. The house stood in front of me, dark and silent. But I could feel the presence of something inside. I could hear the whispers, soft at first, then growing louder as I stepped closer. I raised the lamp, my hands shaking. "Mr. Cheeto!" I called out, my voice trembling but firm. "I know what you're doing. I know your secret." The door creaked open, and there he stood, his face as cold and lifeless as before. "You're too late," he said, his voice low and thick with venom. Then, the shadows came alive. They rushed toward me, swirling around my feet and pulling at my body. But I didn't move. I held the lamp high, focusing all my strength on its light. The shadows recoiled, hissing and screeching as they burned away in the glow. "You cannot defeat me!" Mr. Cheeto cried, his hands outstretched. But I wasn't afraid. I held the light steady, and as the last of the shadows vanished, Mr. Cheeto let out a terrible scream. His body began to twist, shifting and contorting, as if something was fighting to get out. Then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, he collapsed into the dirt, leaving behind nothing but dust. The field was silent again. The air felt lighter, as if the village had been freed from some terrible curse. The morning after I confronted Mr. Cheeto, the village felt different. The air was still, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was like the oppressive weight had been lifted. As I walked through the village, people greeted me with a new sense of peace. No one spoke directly about the events of last night, but there was an unspoken understanding that something had changed. Zenil was waiting for me when I got home. She could tell something had happened, but she didn't ask right away. She just hugged me and said, "You did what you had to do." But even as I tried to reassure her, there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Something wasn't sitting right. Bob and Nia had said I had defeated Mr. Cheeto and his spirits, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished. Later that afternoon, I decided to go back to his house. It was empty now, but I needed to know for sure that it was over. I wasn't afraid, but I knew that facing the unknown would give me the closure I needed. I made my way through the field again. The house looked even worse than I remembered, the windows dark and cracked, the door hanging off its hinges. It was like the house itself had given up after Mr. Cheeto's disappearance. I approached cautiously, my footsteps soft on the dirt path. When I reached the front door, I noticed something strange. The ground around the house was scorched, as if something had burned it. I knelt down to inspect it, but the smell of old wood and ash made me gag. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't quite place what it was. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. But it was only an old man walking down the path from the village. His clothes were ragged, his face weathered by years of toil. "Are you lost?" he asked. "No," I replied quickly. "I'm just looking around." The old man nodded, his eyes never quite meeting mine. "You should leave this place," he said quietly, almost as if he were warning me. I frowned, confused. "Why? What's wrong?" The old man looked down at the ground, then up at the house. "This land, it's cursed. Always has been. No one who lives here ever truly leaves." I took a step back. His words felt like a heavy weight pressing on my chest. "What do you mean?" The man shook his head. "You don't understand. It's not just Mr. Cheeto. He was only the latest in a long line. People come to this land looking for power, but the power here isn't theirs to take. It's the land's. It belongs to something ancient, something far older than any of us." I could feel the blood draining from my face. "What happened to the others? The ones who lived here before?" "They're still here," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible. "They never left. They're the ones who keep the curse alive." I looked back at the house, my mind racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Mr. Cheeto wasn't the first person to fall under this curse. He was just the most recent. And the evil that he had brought with him hadn't disappeared. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice shaking. The old man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking away, disappearing into the distance. But just before he was out of sight, he stopped and looked back at me. "You'll see them soon enough," he said, then walked away without another word. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house, the shadows swirling around it. I kept hearing that old man's warning, "They're still here." I got up from bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. I grabbed the lamp Bob and Nia had given me, my only source of light, and walked out into the night. Zenil was fast asleep, unaware of the growing fear that gnawed at my insides. I went outside and stood in front of the house again. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, and the darkness felt heavier than usual. As I stared at the ruins of Mr. Cheeto's house, I noticed something strange. The windows were glowing. Not from the inside, but from the outside. It was as if the light was coming from the walls themselves, faint but unmistakable. I walked toward the house, the lamp flickering in my hand. The closer I got, the brighter the light became, until it was almost blinding. I reached the front door and pushed it open, the wood creaking under my touch. Inside, everything was still. But the light was there, filling every corner of the room. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath me, and for a moment, I felt a sense of déjà vu, like I had been here before. It was then that I realized something. There was no dust. No signs of decay. The house looked lived in. Suddenly, I heard a sound. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the walls. "Welcome home." The voice was familiar. It sounded like Mr. Cheeto. I turned, my heart racing, and saw a figure standing in the shadows. At first, I thought it was him. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a woman. Her eyes were dark and hollow, her hair long and wild. She stepped forward, her movements smooth, like she had always been there, like she had always belonged. "You've been looking for answers," she said, her voice cold and lifeless. I took a step back. "Who are you?" The woman smiled. "I'm the one who kept Mr. Cheeto here. I'm the one who keeps them all here." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about? What is this place?" She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "This house is a prison. And you're its newest inmate." Before I could react, the shadows around her began to move, forming into shapes I couldn't understand. They twisted and turned, growing larger and darker, until they surrounded me. "No! No!" I screamed, but the shadows closed in. I tried to run, but the shadows were too fast. They wrapped around my legs, pulling me down into the dirt. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought to break free, but it was like the darkness was alive, like it was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every second. I could hear the woman's voice again, soft and mocking. "You thought you could escape, didn't you? You thought you could free the village, but you've only set yourself up for something much worse." The shadows pulled tighter, and I felt myself sinking deeper into the ground. Panic gripped me. I couldn't breathe. Just when I thought I would be swallowed whole, the lamp in my hand flared to life, shining brighter than I'd ever seen it before. The light pushed against the darkness, pushing it back, and for a moment, I felt hope. "Get back!" I shouted, holding the lamp high. The light cut through the shadows like a blade, but the woman laughed, her voice echoing in my ears. "You think that will save you? This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. You can't defeat the curse with a simple light." But I didn't stop. I focused on the light, willing it to burn brighter, to burn everything around me away. The woman's figure flickered, her form becoming less solid, like she was fading. The shadows began to shriek in pain, twisting and writhing, unable to withstand the brightness. Then something happened. The woman screamed, but it wasn't a scream of anger, it was a scream of fear. Her body seemed to disintegrate, her face twisting into something grotesque as she was consumed by the light. As she disappeared, the shadows with her, I could hear the faintest whisper in my ear. "Free us." I didn't understand at first. I wanted to think that I had won, that the curse had finally been broken, but something about that last whisper unsettled me. As the last of the darkness vanished, the house around me felt strangely hollow. The walls were still, but it was like the place had lost its life. I stepped back, my hands shaking. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. It was over. I had defeated them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something deeper than the surface. I turned and ran from the house, not daring to look back. The field felt less menacing now, but the weight of what I'd just experienced pressed heavily on me. As I neared the village, I could see the lights flickering in the distance, the people still going about their lives, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in the dark. But when I got home, I was met by Zanil, who was already awake, sitting by the window. Her face was pale. "What happened?" she asked quietly. I didn't know what to say. I tried to explain, but the words felt too heavy, too complicated. I wasn't sure if I had truly understood it myself. "The house," I whispered. "It wasn't just Mr. Cheeto. He was the last of many, all drawn to that place. There's something about the land, something old. The curse is still there, even if we can't see it. I think we've only broken the surface of it." Zanil didn't say anything for a long time. Then, her voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "They're not gone, are they?" I felt my heart freeze. "What do you mean?" She stood up slowly and walked toward me, her eyes hollow, like something had shifted inside her. "You don't remember, do you?" she said, a small smile creeping onto her lips. "Zanil?" I asked, confusion creeping in. "You freed Mr. Cheeto and the others, didn't you?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. But you didn't free me. My blood ran cold as I saw it. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, now had a dark, lifeless quality to them. I stepped back, my body suddenly cold with fear. You, I whispered. You're one of them. Her smile grew wider, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was a twisted, malicious grin. I've been here all along. I'm the one who started it. I'm the one who brought them all to that land. And now you've freed me. No, I breathed, stepping backward toward the door. No, this can't be. But it was too late. Zenil was no longer the woman I had married. Her form shifted before my eyes, her body elongating and warping, turning into something monstrous. The shadows in the room began to pulse and swirl, as if they were alive, feeding off her newfound power. Did you really think it was over? She asked, her voice now thick and hollow, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth. This was never about Mr. Cheeto. This was about me, about what I wanted. I needed you to break the seal, to break the curse. And now we're free. The room seemed to close in on me. The walls began to pulse, the shadows stretching toward me like reaching hands. I realized then that the curse had never been just about one man. It was about her, about the ancient evil that had been quietly waiting for someone to release it. And I had unknowingly played right into her hands. I backed up, my mind racing. I had made a mistake. I had thought I was saving the village, but in truth, I had freed something far worse. You can't escape, Zenil's voice hissed. You're part of it now. And you'll never leave. I turned and ran, but the shadows followed me, whispering my name. The village outside was silent, the air thick with the stench of death. As I ran, I felt the darkness close in on me, and I realized, too late, that the evil wasn't gone. It had only just begun. The curse still lingers, and I don't know if I'll ever be free. But I hope my story will serve as a warning to anyone who thinks they can escape the darkness. It's always watching, always waiting. And once you've been touched by it, there's no turning back.